Would you agree that family relationships can be the hardest relationships? We'll talk about why that is. But for now, I'll just say this. To you who have struggled with a child who won't see common sense, or with a parent or a grandparent who is being stubborn, or with a sibling, a brother or sister who is doing something that isn't right, that you just don't agree with, or with an in-law who makes you angry, who disrupts your family, or even with a brother or sister in faith who frustrates you. To you who have felt that special strife that can exist in the family, that maybe only exists in the family, I pray that you will focus your heart and your mind on 2 verses from the book of Hebrews and learn to see family differently. Hebrews 2, verse 10 to start. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. We'll get to the next verse, but there's something in this verse that makes a Christian say, wait, that doesn't sound right. Did you catch what it was? It was right at the end. God made the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. God made the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Let's explore that phrase. So, the author of salvation, who is that? That's Jesus, right? It's a neat picture. Like an author sits down and crafts a story with characters and plot lines and maybe even a happy ending. So Jesus has crafted a story that ends happily for us by suffering and dying on the cross for us. But the tricky part is what God did to the author of our salvation, right? God made him perfect through suffering. That's the part that doesn't sound right. What does it mean that Jesus was made perfect? Right? I mean, does that mean that Jesus was sinful and then God made him sinless? Does this mean that Jesus was only a human like us and then God, perfected him, made him something more like God? Maybe you already know that if that's true, we're lost. If a sinful human suffered and died for us on the cross, what was that? That's a meaningless sacrifice then. So thank God that this passage in Hebrews is not saying that Jesus was sinful. What does it mean that Jesus was made perfect? Maybe a historical analogy will help you out, a historical illustration. So think for me World War II. United States Marines land on islands that are heavily fortified and fight a Japanese army that refuses to surrender, that is fighting to the last man. Rain pounds the Marines every day. Enemies jump into their foxholes at night with knives and bayonets. They quickly learn not to offer medical aid to the Japanese wounded because the wounded carry live grenades. What happens when those Marines finally take that island? What have they become? A brotherhood of blood and suffering and death. And what happens when they go to the next island and fresh recruits join them from the homeland? Are those fresh recruits one of them? Are they accepted immediately into the brotherhood? No. They have to experience the island themselves first. If you can, take that and put it over this passage in Hebrews, because that's what the author to the Hebrews is saying. He's saying that Jesus came to our island and experienced it. He came to earth and experienced what it truly means to be human. Think about it. Without his mother's milk as a baby, what would have happened to him? He would have starved, just like us. When his friend Lazarus died, what did he do? He wept just like we weep when our loved ones die. When the Roman whips cut into his back, what happened? He bled just like we bleed. When he was on the cross, what happened? He suffered what humanity deserves to suffer. So let's put it all together. By doing that, by suffering what we deserve to suffer, by suffering what we do suffer, he was made what? Perfect. Not in a sinful or sinless sense. He was made perfectly human. Completely human. Completely able to identify with humanity. Or you could say it like this: by joining our brotherhood of suffering and death, by being on the island with us, he was made the perfect candidate to stand in for us on the cross. Makes sense? Isn't this an amazing reality? And what this actually means for you is incredible, and that's what we're going to get in verse 11. Here it is again. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. I deliberated for a while on how to describe this verse, and the phrase that I came up with isn't new or exciting, but it is meaningful, I hope. It's life-changing. This is a life-changing verse. Christ gives you his holy life. So he joined our brotherhood. He experienced the island that we live on perfectly. And then he gives you that perfection. And what does that mean? It means that you and Jesus are, quote, of the same family. He, quote, is not ashamed to call you his brothers. Okay, so realize the transaction that has happened here. Jesus suffering alongside us on the island and suffering for us did not install him permanently down here in the realm of man. What did it do? The opposite. Jesus' suffering has pulled us up into his heavenly family. We are his brothers. We are his sisters. We are children, perfect, sinless, like him, of the heavenly Father. That's amazing. That's a beautiful truth. But on this side of heaven, it doesn't always look beautiful, does it? Because again, family relationships can be the hardest relationships. And maybe you already know why that is, but let's explore it a little bit. So grandparents and parents and brothers and sisters and cousins and relatives and in-laws and anybody else you can lump in there. You've experienced life together. You've experienced the same things. Grandma has cooked you the same meals. You've been on vacations together. You've mourned together. When there's a reason to get together, it's these people that you go to, right? You have that brotherhood, that special bond forged over shared experience, both good and bad experience. And maybe you realize that it's because of that closeness, because of that intimacy, because you have so much invested in these people, that they are the ones who can hurt you the most. And they are the ones whom you can hurt the most. These are the people whose love we take for granted, right? We stop caring about how we treat them with our words and actions, or maybe we stop showing them that we care with our words and actions. We stop nurturing them. We stop actively loving them because we take it for granted that they love us, and it will always be there. And aren't these the people whose flaws we know? Whose flaws we can expose if we want to? I mean, you don't have to be married long to know that spouses know the right words to use and the right tones to use to set each other off, to make each other angry, right? Grandparents, parents, children, I think they know what to do and what to say to make each other feel guilty, to make each other feel bad. in-laws and other relatives, they know how to be bitter about the past. We could go on like this for a long time, but I'll say this. How tragic is it that the people God has given us to love the most are those we can most easily abuse? I mean, think about that in terms of your spiritual family too, the people sitting beside you. If we are Jesus' brothers and sisters, if he's pulled us up into the heavenly family and made us brothers and sisters with him, what does that make us? That we're brothers and sisters with each other too. And these are the people we say we'll pray for. But we don't. These are the people we should be most ready to forgive. But do you ever find yourself holding on to anger and resentment instead? These are the people who should receive the highest levels of our patience and our understanding and our humility and our respect. But it's easier to criticize and complain, so we choose that instead. Again, how tragic that sin exists where love should thrive. So in this family strife, both the family that's born of blood and the family born of God, I see two options going forward. So number one is you can pretend like it doesn't exist, the problems, the strife, and maybe you can reflect and realize you're doing that. There's issues and you just ignore them. You're like a child when he's angry. Just lock yourself in your room and ignore the problem. And maybe doing that, maybe the saying will come true. That holding on to anger is like holding on to a burning coal. You're the one who gets hurt. The better option, of course, is number two. When there's family strife, whether that's family born of blood or family born of God, in that strife, you can draw on the strength of what Christ has done to make you his family. You can remember what you were and who you were. You were a spiritual orphan. You were familyless. Then Christ came, suffered alongside you, suffered for you. When you've been unkind and unfair, when you've taken your family for granted, he suffered for it. When you've been impatient with them, he suffered for it. When you've been angry with hatred at your in-laws and other relatives, he suffered for it. When you've been frustrated and unfair toward your brothers and sisters here, he suffered for it. I tell you now, in Christ, the Son of God made Son of Man, all this forgiven, all of it. And now, you can reflect on what Christ has done to make you his family member, onto them, onto the brothers and sisters here, onto the family at home and abroad. You can reflect it onto them. Have your parents hurt you? Have your children hurt you? Have your brothers and sisters hurt you? Have your in-laws and relatives hurt you? Have your brothers and sisters in faith frustrated you? I suppose you can abandon ship. That's the easy thing to do, isn't it? Act like it doesn't exist. Ignore the problem. I don't think you will. Because God has made you his child. Christ has pulled you up into a family that has higher values, the values of love and grace and mercy. And now you can reflect that onto the family here. This is what I mean. As you have confessed your sin to God, which you did earlier in this service, we all did. As you have confessed your sin to God and asked for forgiveness, so you are ready to confess your sin to those you have hurt here and ask for forgiveness. And as you have been forgiven, I proclaimed it to you earlier, I proclaimed it to you in this sermon, you have been forgiven. As you have received forgiveness from God, so you are ready to offer forgiveness to the blood family and God family that has hurt you here. I know part of the question when you talk about this is always, but will my love be received? Will it be returned? Will it be appreciated? What do you think? Maybe. Maybe not. But that's not the point. The point is that Christ has pulled you into a brotherhood of blood. His blood. The point is that Christ has pulled you into a brotherhood of suffering and death. His suffering and death. The point is that we love the family that God has given us, just as God has loved us enough to make us his family.